The movie Bambi is a masterpiece that touched generations, and Walt Disney believed it was one of his most artistic triumphs. In the days before digital and now AI, it took a village to get these films to the silver screen, and Bambi was one of the most difficult films to make. At the heart of it all was a little-known immigrant artist named Tyrus Wong. His striking style changed everything. University of Houston professor Karen Fang wrote the book Background Artist, revealing the untold story behind the magic. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, first let's tell the background story on you. Film scholar and cultural critic, and you write and speak for global museums and film festivals. What got you into this area of education?
Oh my gosh, I love watching movies. When I'm a child of the 80s, and so I grew up when VHS and camcorders became available. I'm a child of Spielberg, right? And so I've just always loved movies. Yeah. I love storytelling.
And you love art too.
Yes.
I mean, you actually, paint classes at Glassell School,
and
professor at U of H.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. You teach Introduction to Literary Studies, Hong Kong cinema, theories of the moving image, all of that. We look at arts and sometimes we dismiss it, and oftentimes we say it's all about the technology and STEAM and the whole bit, or not STEAM but STEM, but STEAM is important too. That is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our art is what makes us human, right? Art produces emotion, right? Art, precisely because it doesn't have to perform a function, right? It shows us this is like what we're feeling, and this is our consciousness. It's not just simply practical. Yeah. This is where we express our soul.
All right, you came across Tyrus Wong. How did you come across Tyrus Wong, and what moved you so much that you thought, I need to dig more into this story and make sure other people know his story?
So when he passed at the very end of 2016, he died at 106.
Wow.
So there was a ton.
That's another book.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all in there.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of coverage of him because it was such an amazing story. This centenarian who had played this absolutely instrumental role in the making of this iconic classic Disney film, and that he had been an immigrant who at the time could not become a citizen, right? So that story in and of itself was amazing. And as a film scholar, I wanted to learn more. There was a documentary that had come out just before he passed. And I just wanted to learn out more about this whole story. And once you get into his biography and understand not just the immigration and the Disney history, but that he had been a practicing fine artist before Disney, that he had gone on to work on so many other fields, that he's one of the nation's leading greeting card artists.
He defined a genre too,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
His father had really encouraged him to practice calligraphy daily. And we know with the Chinese alphabet, I mentioned earlier that my early years were spent in Asia. The Chinese alphabet itself is a piece of art. To learn how to do that is really amazing to me. But he practiced also calligraphy, and he used watercolors on newspaper because he didn't have the supplies. He did what it took to create the art.
Right. So they were very poor, like most Chinese immigrants were at the time. And so his father was teaching him Chinese calligraphy, which is a brush painting. And they would actually use just water on newspaper. And they were partly just because it was cheap, right? You can just save the newspaper, you waters everywhere. But it also just teaches you that you can't make a mistake with brush painting.
Yeah.
And so when you're doing that as a child, he learns very quickly to sort of master the command of the brush.
And to be resourceful. He got a scholarship to the Otis Art Institute, but worked there as a janitor while studying.
Yeah, because again, he was an immigrant, right? He wasn't going to, he wasn't taking anything for granted. He was lucky to get in on a scholarship, but he still had to pay tuition, he had to pay locker fees, he had to pay for supplies. And so he was working as a janitor, to help pay the bill.
Yeah, all right. In Disney, we know Snow White changed Hollywood, right? And it made audiences really care about hand-drawn characters. But then Bambi comes along, and there was, they had to figure out a mystery, if you will, because they're trying to make these animals come to life, and there's, of course, the whole forest, all that was a big challenge.
Yeah, so animating Bambi was always going to be a problem because first of all, they're animals, so it was hard to figure out human beings, right? And then all of a sudden, like Walt Disney's like, we're going to make a story all about animals, and you have to make them talk. Every animal moves differently. They have different shaped faces. So it was this huge animation problem, and it just wasn't working, and it was just costing the studio so much money. They had brought in all these artists, and then Tyrus, who was working at the time in this very entry-level position, sort of hears the rumor, the gossip around the studio, and he thinks, thinks, you know, was already an accomplished fine artist, and he thinks, I think the problem is actually the backgrounds, that the backgrounds need to be more subdued to allow the animals to stand out.
Yeah, yeah. And really what it did was kind of change, like I mentioned earlier, the genre of how things were done. And so in this book, you go through all of that. You have art prints for Roosevelt's works, Progress Administration, all types of things that he did after that as well.
Yeah, so the WPA work was actually before Disney. Okay. You know, it was in the beginning of the middle of the Depression. But remember, Tyrus was known for doing this sort of Chinese-style brushwork. So he had imported from the calligraphy this kind of very confident brushwork style that was very evocative in this sort of Chinese style of painting, which is very suggestive.
Yeah, just looking at that right there, it's so beautiful. Right, it's got power in it.
You just use this very intentional line, right? And so instead of like being overly detailed, very precious, the kind of Western style, European style painting, it's much more evocative, mysterious.
Yeah.
Like,
well, it makes, I think, the viewer,
mood.
you're part of the process, right?
Yes.
Because you have to complete the messaging there.
And that's a unifying theme through all of his art practice, through all of his media, through all the different decades that he was working. That what you'll always see is this, you know, this powerful suggestion.
Yeah, you tell that story, but you also tell much more about his background, and so beyond Bambi. And so what is it you want people to get when they close the book and they get to the end?
Well, I mean, you know, I think that I've never met anybody who, once they hear about Tyrus's story, isn't touched and inspired. Yeah. Because when you hear the story of this person who lives 106, everyone wants that secret. First of all, right?
Yeah.
You know, but to know that he did this in the face of Chinese exclusion, he couldn't become a citizen for many decades into his adult career, right? You know, that he manages to reach the top of his artistic career over and over and over again in all of these different fields, right? It's the power of creativity, to bring together communities, right? For inclusion, right? For people to see past race or identity or language, right? I think that's the big takeaway for everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for giving us this takeaway, and go Cougs.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Background artists can be found wherever books are sold. For more information, visit greatdayhouston.com and we will connect you.